नाज़रीन इकराम, यूट्यूब पर जाने आलम खाकी टीवी देखने वालों को वेलकम। आज के इस सेशन में मैं एक यूथ को दावत दे रहा हूँ, एक नौजवान को दावत दे रहा हूँ कि वो हमसे जवानों के पर्सपेक्टिव के बारे में कुछ गुफ्तगू करें कि उनका लाइफ पर्सपेक्टिव क्या है। आपको याद होगा मैंने पिछले वीडियोस में आपसे प्रॉमिस किया है कि लाइफ के बारे में जो मुख्तलिफ पर्सपेक्टिव्स हैं, मुख्तलिफ लोगों के पर्सपेक्टिव्स हैं, तो वो आपके साथ शेयर किए जाएं ताकि हम डिफरेंट लोगों के लाइफ पर्सपेक्टिव्स को सुनकर अपने पर्सपेक्टिव्स के साथ कंपेयर करें, देखें कि हम औरों से और क्या सुन सकते हैं और क्या जान सकते हैं और अपनी लाइफ को बेहतर कर सकते हैं। तो इस लिहाज से आज मैंने एक नौजवान जनाब साहिल बदरुद्दीन उनको दावत दिया है और जिनसे मैं आपसे माजरत के साथ इंग्लिश में गुफ्तगू करूँगा क्योंकि वो इंग्लिश में ज़्यादा कंफर्टेबल हैं। तो इसलिए इसके बाद हमारा ये वीडियो जो है वो इंग्लिश और लिटिल बिट ऑफ उर्दू समरी साथ साथ में चलेंगे। ठीक है जी। अभी मुझे दावत देने दीजिए जनाब साहिल बदरुद्दीन को। साहिल, वेलकम टू दिस डिस्कशन ऑन लाइफ and perspectives on life. Thank you for sparing time for today.
No, thank you for having me.
My pleasure, and audience's pleasure. Sahil, I shared with you in my introduction that we are exploring life, the way it looks to the people, the way people feel life, different segments of society, how they feel life. So being a very young, energetic, and intellectual, energetic young man who has so much read and knows so much about thinkers of modern times, so you are uniquely placed to share some of your thoughts with other youngsters and other listeners of this particular channel. So Sahil, can you first of all introduce yourself in a couple of sentences? How would you see yourself? How do you see yourself?
How do I see myself?
Yeah, as a young man, in terms of your life.
I think the best way I would describe myself is a free spirit intellectual.
Wow, free spirit
Intellectual.
Okay.
And I was born in India.
Mhm.
Came to the United States when I was very young. And I grew up most of my life here, went to university here.
Okay.
And I have studied, a variety of subjects at university. I studied, I majored in chemical engineering,
Chemical engineering. Okay.
religious studies, and history.
Oh, yes. Okay. Okay.
So I ended up doing a couple of majors, and that's kind of shaped how, and those were based on how I kind of looked at the world, and then they have shaped on how I look at the world.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. Okay. All three are quite interesting subjects. One coming from pure science, the other the civilizational dimension that relates to religion, and then history, of course, another very interesting subject. By the way, I have a lot of interest in religion and history. I have less background in engineering, but that engineering is very, very important. Yeah, I do understand that. So, as a young man living in one of the most developed countries, how do you see life appears to youth?
To youth in general.
Youth in general, and maybe then your own perception.
Sure. I think the youth we're talking about particularly in the United States, of course, varies on the demographics we're looking at, the different ethnicity and other things we're looking at as well. But I think youth in general, around the ages of young professionals, let's say around the age from 22 to 30, generally are in a very interesting phase in their life, right? They now have gotten out of school.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have to worry about the general schooling and other things.
Mm-hmm.
And yet now they're in careers and other things where they are making good amount of money, living independently, and exploring and learning about different phases of life that they never had the independence to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So they're in a phase where they're not all married. Generally, people in the West, in particular United States, get married, when they're older, and so they have the time and the spirit, the time and um, the freedom to explore and think about world issues, to think about how they want to shape their lives, what passions do they have, what interests do they have. Yet, I think the youth, particularly, are very much into um equality, very much into different forms of thinking that are egalitarian, and how to better society and how to improve society in general. I think is an issue that the this age group particularly looks at.
Okay. It's my general experience. I may be wrong, but my general impression is that very often youths across the world tend to look at the youths here in the
Hmm.
United States.
Hmm.
What do you think is the major reason?
I think it's a bit of idealism.
Uh-huh.
I think the grass is always greener on the other side, as they say,
Okay.
right? And so, what particularly the youth in, let's say, not in the West, look at the West as the proper way of living or how we should be living. And I don't
Mm-hmm.
think that's always the best. That's
Mm-hmm.
not always the proper way of looking at things.
Mm-hmm. But do you think, say, after 60s and 17 onwards, do you think this fun-loving, you know, leading a casual life,
Hmm.
music, dance, and other these kinds of leisure, types of life
Hmm.
tend to appeal more to the new generations.
Hmm.
And somehow this current, quote unquote, this current or trend in the United States, picking up very strongly, has influenced the world across. Take the example of, for example, jeans.
Hmm.
The culture of jeans has spread so much across the world. It's not that only in the United States people put on jeans, but somehow it is associated with this culture. So, in terms of dressing, the kind of music, pop music, and what have it has influenced many arenas of the culture across the globe.
Hmm.
Um, so, where do you see this inspiration picking up as opposed to, for example, people's different ways of looking at life being fixed, permanent values, you know, stable life, and what have you?
Mm. I think culture has become globalized, right? Even
Yes,
popular culture
yes,
has become globalized,
yes,
right? So what, like you mentioned, genes, it spreads around the globe
yes,
as a culture and a
yeah.
way of doing things.
Hmm.
And so I think culture itself is spread across,
Hmm.
and behavior, of course, is spread across, right? In ways that the youth act in the United States may be looked upon the way that it's okay to act in other countries.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. Also, I feel that the explosion of the fields of studies
Hmm.
in many directions, to what extent do you think the Western youth has benefited from the university education?
I think variety of subjects that would not have been available maybe even 30 years ago
Hmm.
are available now
Now,
for the taking. For example, uh, there are a lot more courses in the liberal arts that were not available back, even 20, 30 years ago. And
Mhm.
so there's a dimension of knowledge, more specific knowledge that is available in terms of the liberal arts and other things. Um, to people in universities that they can take courses on and share, whether it's hip hop or jazz from the music area to health, to any dimension, fashion, to religion, to Islamic studies. whatever has been opened up in terms of courses. But now with the advent of the internet and different things, those courses are readily available for
Hmm.
around the world to kind of access those
Hmm.
courses. But I think there's also a lack. I think among the youth, there's also it's there's a common saying that you'll end up changing your careers a couple of times in your lifetime.
Yeah, and particularly mid-career,
Right.
changes. Yes,
Yeah.
changing of fields.
Right.
You know.
So that happens sometimes where people take on different fields of study. They go on for a master's in a different field than they studied their undergrad, and so there's a lot more um, space for passion and exploration, which is a
Hmm.
good side. But I think there's also um, I want to say a naiveness a bit, if I
Uh-huh.
may use the word,
Hmm.
of that the traditional, and I'm talking here particularly among the youth of the United States,
Okay.
that you know the general things such as family or children um, are constructs perhaps, and they're not something that there's those are things society has imposed on you rather than something to be taken on as uh, a kind of progression, perhaps,
Hmm.
if that makes sense.
Right, right. It does. I have many critical questions. We may not have time to discuss all of them, but two things are very high on my mind at this point in time while discussing with you as a young man. One is this whole notion of, survival of the fittest.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think survival of the fittest has engendered too much craze for competition in the society? And how has that impacted the youth's life?
Sure. So it's actually really affected in a big way. And what I mean by that is that, as I mentioned, things have become globalized.
Hmm.
So careers and opportunities that would be readily available are now being exported to overseas.
Hmm.
And so, for example, you can get good services on computer science overseas for a much
Hmm.
lower cost. And so, certain fields and certain avenues have been exported externally because there's people who can provide high level of skill for a lower cost.
Hmm.
And so, more particularized skills such as use of critical thinking
Hmm.
and other things are much more valued in terms of careers and getting opportunities.
Right. That takes me to this whole notion of the youngsters, you know, grabbing the most interesting, jobs in the society.
Mm,
And very often the seniors getting little bit marginalized.
mm,
Be- and one thinker has used the word de-skilling. For many of people like
mm,
me, the kinds of skills with which we were
mhm,
equipped,
mhm,
we are beginning to get de-skilled,
mhm,
and we are then forced to learn new skills to
mhm,
compete with the youngsters.
mm,
Increasingly, this is becoming a big issue. For example, increasingly younger people are taking senior positions like positions of CEOs and what have you.
yes.
Allama Iqbal had used, had said a beautiful verse which is worth mentioning here while we are discussing about youth. And he had said, खिरत को गुलामी से आजाद कर,
Mhm,
खिरत को गुलामी से आजाद कर, जवानों को पीरों का उस्ताद कर. This he said around 100, years back, probably. But what the verse means is that he counsels the new generations as well as the senior people in the new age. And he says that please make the intellect, please not make, relieve from the prison, you know, um, relieve the intellect from the prison.
mhm,
जवानों को पीरों का उस्ताद कर, and make the young the teachers of the old.
Mm.
So he had said in those days where I think there wasn't that much talk of young people, there
Mm.
must have been some talk of young people. And being a visionary, he said, in the future, the senior people, the older people should make the young people as their teachers, as their leaders. I find this idea fascinating. But having said that, the difficulty I see is a big gap, the generational gap. It has always been there, generational gap, but till around industrial times, industrial revolution times, and of course later, the gap is increasing day by day.
Mm.
So, do you
A gap
see
in terms of.
in terms of the youngsters and the senior people
Mm-hmm.
in these times, do you experience this generational gap
Mm-hmm.
within yourself and among the friends
Mm-hmm.
among whom you have
Is
company?
this a gap in terms of skills, or in gaps in terms
In
of?
many ways, for perceptions of life, values of life,
Mm-hmm.
choices, preferences in terms of leisure, daily life, how children should behave,
Sure.
everything that has to do with life.
Yeah.
For example, what kind of a girl, a young man, or a woman should, or a young man should be selected,
Mm-hmm.
their criteria. And when we are in a company or in an institution or organization, our preferences within those organizations, youngster going more for innovation,
Mm-hmm.
and senior people, very generally speaking, towards stability.
Mm-hmm.
So this there are many ways to describe this
Sure.
generational gap,
Mm-hmm.
but I personally feel, in my experience of working with the seniors, youngsters, and others,
Mm-hmm.
I feel that in this country, for example, generally the youngsters think the seniors, are the people of the past.
Mm.
Um, and they know very little, if anything, about the modern life, and therefore they should remain more silent
Mm.
than speaking.
Sure. I think there is a big segment of the youth that feel that way, but I feel like this is a constant cycle that happens with the old and the youth,
Mm-hmm.
where one generation gets older
Mm.
and the younger generation feels that the older generation doesn't understand them, and
Yes.
then vice versa, the younger generation doesn't feel that the older generation understands them, and it always creates these gaps and thinking differences in
Mhm.
mindsets and other things. That I think is a part of human society that we've seen. I think what's more particular is with the ways that things change so fast nowadays,
Yes.
right? For example, with COVID and other things. So the rate of change has become so fast. For example, there's something once read a study or something which said that from, let's say, 2022 to 2028, or I believe 2020 to 2026, in a matter of 6 years, the world would change so much that it changed from 1900 to 2000,
Oh, wow.
right?
Oh, wow.
So in a matter of 6 years, the world is changing so quickly,
So quickly.
right? So I think with the rate of change, those chasms and those gaps just further and further increase. And I'll give a particular example, right? I think a good example is in terms of value systems. I think the value systems in particular, some of them, not all of them, are different amongst the youth in general
Mm-hmm.
and the elderly in general, right? And one example is, let's say, there's a high price that the youth value in terms of individual freedom, the value
Yes.
of individual freedom,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is not as heavily held perhaps among the older generations,
True.
right? And so this chasm of freedom, uncontrolled freedom, individual freedom, license will be a space that you'll continuously see gaps in, and I think it'll actually, this is a space where without dialogue and without really understanding each other,
Mm-hmm.
I think that chasm will increase.
Yes, I perfectly agree with you. I think, as you earlier mentioned, this whole notion of change versus stability.
Mm-hmm.
Eh, there are arguments on both sides,
Mm-hmm.
but the fact is that life changes, that we all agree. But what does that change mean is highly debatable
Sure.
for youngsters, for seniors. Um, I'm just wondering one question, which is difficult to answer. I
Mm-hmm.
do appreciate, but I'm just wondering how you would respond to that question. All these opportunities,
Mm-hmm.
all these fun opportunities,
Mm-hmm.
all these leisure
Mm-hmm.
opportunities, with everything on youngsters' side, do you think that life for youngsters today leads to more happiness?
Mm-hmm.
Or, for example, life where there is stability, say in rural areas,
Mm-hmm.
semi-urban areas or peri-urban areas, where the life is more stable,
Mm-hmm.
values are more stable. Do you think the youth there are happier?
In rural areas? Where?
Yeah, in rural developing countries, for example,
Sure.
even within the United States also, there are rural areas.
Yeah.
Um, we're all developing countries. I'm wondering in terms of stable societies where values are stable, where
Mm-hmm.
things don't change the way change here.
Mm-hmm.
As you mentioned, right? In 6 years, things
Yeah.
change for, that haven't changed for a
Right.
century. But when you have too much speed,
Yeah.
you know, it's like standing on a river bank
Mm-hmm.
and you watch the river running fast, it creates dizziness.
Sure.
It creates dizziness. I'm just wondering whether the speed of change is creating a sense of dizziness.
Sure. I think there's a lot of things to be said here, right?
Mhm.
And I think it's really a question of how you define happiness. And
Yes,
it's really not an issue of how fast change is happening because change is always happening. Sure,
yes.
the pace of change, I think,
The
affects things
rate
as
of
a,
change,
it
the
does
scope
affect
of
things,
change,
right?
yes.
As I mentioned earlier, I think the issue here is more of, as I go back to earlier, of what things are people valuing, right? And I think that there is less emphasis and priority given to stability in terms of the traditional means of family, of children, of those kinds of things are the traditional, I would say, ways of looking at things are not seen as measures, or at least not seen as the first measures of happiness
Hmm.
among the particularly people in the West,
Hmm.
right? It's more success in terms of your career, in terms of your own individual kind of persona. And so this leads to a shifting in priorities in terms
Yes.
of what would be defined as happiness or what can bring you happiness, right?
Hmm.
And I think that shifting of priorities is where the question of the happiness in the long term run can provide. As you mentioned, right? People can get, packages delivered to their home. They have so much leisure time. They have so much, they can watch whatever they want on TV, right? They can spend time with friends and they have so much material luxuries that they have that we've never had before, perhaps in human history. At the touch of a button, I can touch a button and call a car.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
can touch a button and get the
yeah,
pizza
yeah, yeah,
delivered,
yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's so easy, very
Yes,
easily done,
yes, yes.
right? And so I think happiness always is a formula that comes from gratefulness, right?
Hmm.
And it's really how you're looking at the gratefulness of different things that you can get,
Hmm.
and how thankful you are for those things.
Hmm.
And so it's something that comes from the inside. Happiness doesn't come from the surroundings, right?
Okay.
And so I think as long as the youth kind of misunderstand or look for happiness in their surroundings, in their external world, which is what
Hmm.
it is, which is why the dimension of change doesn't make a difference in terms
Hmm.
of happiness, because it comes from the inside.
Hmm.
Then I think they will continue to look for different ways of finding happiness that may keep them going in directions that might not be the best.
Right. Um, it makes sense what you are saying.
Yeah, a lot more can be said, but
Oh, of
yeah,
course, of course. We are just very
yeah,
brief,
yeah.
and we are trying to pick up some key things, for
Hmm.
discussion. Maybe one of the last probably questions that I would like to seek your opinion, and that is that, do you think there is quite a bit of confusion between pleasure, joy,
Hmm.
and happiness
Hmm.
versus also meaning of life?
Hmm.
In the craze for more pleasure,
Hmm.
more joy,
Hmm.
and probably more happiness, we tend to probably forget the very meaning of life.
Hmm.
When I use that word meaning of life, many might raise their eyebrows because they do not see this as a terribly important dimension of our
Hmm.
life.
The meaning of
Searching
life.
for the meaning of life.
Okay.
Many, and I know many very good speakers nowadays speak, this is not a very strong, useful language
Mm.
to hang on, to
Mm.
say or to insist on a or the meaning of life.
Hmm.
How do you look at it?
The meaning of how do I look at it?
Yeah, first the pleasure,
Hmm.
the joy, the happiness,
Mm.
getting confused
Mm.
for joy, and of course then within this context the meaning of life. Do you think meaning of life is then put on back burner?
For me or for
Just your own personal ways,
sure,
and then how do you see this among your friends,
sure. So I
young
think
people?
for me, I think you need to have a purpose of life,
Mm-hmm.
right? And meaning of life is a different question, but I think you need to have a purpose in life, right? Because you need to have a purpose-driven life. And I
Mm-hmm.
think your purpose then defines the direction in which your life takes, right? The meaning of life is a bigger philosophical question, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some say the struggle is the meaning of life,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I think it really depends. That's a deeper discussion in the sense of there's quite a few philosophies that people look at when it comes to the meaning of life,
Okay.
right?
How about the distinction between pleasure and happiness?
I think the pleasure is confused with happiness, right? I
Okay.
think one of the things I didn't mention earlier, but what I wanted to say was, I think the youth in particular, because of social media and other metrics that are so easily with a touch of a button they can
Yes, yes,
access,
yes,
there's a there's a false mindset of instant gratification, is the term,
yes, yes.
right? And that, but life doesn't work in instant gratification. Relationships don't work in instant gratification. Job satisfaction doesn't work in instant gratification. The things that are meaningful in life, right? Not meaning of life, but meaningful in life, do not come from instant gratification,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, as long as we are in this pleasure mode, thinking that the instant gratification will bring us happiness,
Mm.
as long as we're in that mode, then we don't really understand what true happiness is. And I think what lasting happiness is. And I think the proper word here is fulfillment is,
Mm.
right? And so whether it's spiritual or in other things. And so I think it leads to just superficial understandings of the
Mm-hmm.
words pleasure and happiness and different things like that. I think there's also, like I mentioned, a naiveness among the youth in general, and I'm talking about everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Um, is there seems to be this almost know-it-all attitude, right? And I think we're all guilty of this from time to time, right? Including myself.
Mm-hmm.
And rather than this openness, humble views of looking at what life comes at us, looking at it, challenging us, moving forward. There's a bit of arrogance in that way that you have all the answers,
Mm-hmm.
rather than this openness of looking at things and figuring out things and finding pleasure and happiness from the struggle itself, if I
Mm-hmm.
may use the connection between struggle is the meaning of
Sure.
life. And that is your joy, right?
Mm.
And so I think they get confused in um, just more simple ways of thinking.
Right. Interestingly enough, in many of the developing countries, more particularly in this country, in the United States, if we look at the demographies, surveys of happiness,
Mm,
um, medical problems of the people, health problems of the people, overall, family relationships,
hmm
you know. So it seems that the kind of goody-goody image
hmm
that we have of this country within and outside,
Sure.
um, very often in many areas,
hmm
it may not be that goody-goody. Though in many areas, of course, in this country, people are really privileged in many ways, like
Absolutely.
facilities, personal freedoms,
hmm
and what have you. But at the same time, I think as the life becomes faster, fastest, that itself is throwing many challenges for people's
hmm
health, for people's happiness,
hmm
people's relationships, and what have you. So life is very complex, as we know, for every segment of society, whether they are youth, seniors, women, men,
Always,
children,
always
they
will
are
be.
very
Yeah.
complex. But maybe drawing towards the end, what would be your message to the youths of this country and beyond?
Mm. So this country and beyond.
Yes.
I think let us not. I think the message would be let us not think that tradition and the past has nothing to teach us. It has a
Okay.
lot to teach us.
Mm-hmm.
And what we learn from our pasts, what we learn from our histories, what we learn from our traditional values will be important for us in terms of how we conduct our lives. And not everything is outdated, old fashioned, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are things of essential value,
Mm-hmm.
of things that will always be there, right? Um, and so let us not kind of think that we know it all and that we can solve everything just because we're educated, and that there is wisdom to be learned from others and people who are older than us, and even younger than us,
Mm-hmm.
and to kind of use those as ongoing metrics of this lifelong learning would be the best way forward.
Thank you very much, Sahil. Well said, very well articulated. I personally feel that the key points you emphasized is this, balance or good negotiation
hmm
between the past and present,
hmm
change and stability, you know, um, learning from the past, but also looking into the future. So we should be open to interpretation, reinterpretation of our traditions or values, um, and this whole question of youth enthusiasm
hmm
for change, is only natural.
always
That
has
is
been.
always natural,
Yeah.
they make the present future
hmm
by actually
Yeah, well said.
envisioning
Yeah.
the future, and there is a lot to learn. Thank you very much, Sahil, for sparing time with our viewers and myself here. It was thoroughly enjoyable, the discussion points that you raised, and I hope many of our audiences have got some insights or terrific insights from this discussion. Thank you very much, our audiences, wherever you are listening. I hope you look at and listen to this discussion and see what your perspectives are about youth, or the perspectives that youth need to examine, look at in our times. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for watching Janam Bhaki TV. Thank you very much.